outrageous confrontational stuff. The guy who threatens bodily harm to the chairman of the Federal Reserve instead of saying a bunch of really boring stuff about what his own monetary policy would be as president. That's boring. This is his brand. This is the kind of thing that Rick Perry wants to be known for, saying the blunt, impolitic thing, letting people know how tough he is. And as such, this is one of those moments that is sort of a test for the political system and for the political media. Are you going to help this guy do what he wants you to do? If you want to talk about extremism and Rick Perry, you sort of have two options just from, say, today's news. You could talk about Rick Perry's intemperately over-tough language implying perhaps not metaphorical violence toward an economic policy official. That is, in fact, a form of stylistic extremism, which he would be delighted for you to cover. Pleased, he'd be very pleased if you were outraged about it, so try to be outraged. Or another option is to talk about Rick Perry saying that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme that is unconstitutional and must be abolished at the federal level. That's a different kind of Rick Perry extremism. You can talk about Rick Perry saying yesterday that the United States government should have defaulted rather than raising the debt ceiling, saying he would have voted against raising the debt ceiling. That's another option. That's substantive extremism. Governor Perry made it clear last month that in his mind, the United States going into default would be no big deal.
I think this threat that somehow or another the world's going to come to an end, and the threat of we're not going to be able to pay our bills is a bit of a stretch.
So that's an option. That sort of comment. That's substantive Rick Perry extremism, and that is available for discussion. Rick Perry also opposed to the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. Repealing that, of course, would eliminate the federal income tax, which would remove 80% of all government revenue, because that'll help the debt problem. That is, strictly speaking, in terms of its relationship to mainstream economic thinking, that kind of idea, get rid of the source of 80% of all federal revenue, getting rid of the income tax altogether, that, technically speaking, is extreme when compared to mainstream economic thought. Perhaps if he was threatening to beat the 16th Amendment to death in Texas, instead of proposing just to repeal it, maybe then we could get some kind of political shock and outrage over that kind of extremism as well. Joining us now here on set is Ezra Klein, columnist for The Washington Post and Bloomberg, and an MSNBC policy analyst. Ezra, I got to tell you, you have been doing a great job hosting in the afternoons on the Martin Bashir Show.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
What is your take on Rick Perry's warning to the chairman of the Fed?
I'm sort of loving it. Is that a fair take?
Okay.
We are having, I guess, an ideas campaign. What was remarkable about that Perry clip, if you actually backed it up a little bit, is he began that segment by saying, I'm not going to take a position on the Federal Reserve. I think he said, I want no part of it.
Oh, he said, yeah, I want to take a pass.
Then he thought for a moment and said, actually, if I was going to have a position, we should possibly beat him. It's really quite a take, but it is extraordinarily ignorant. I mean, even putting aside the question of how much money you print, between now and the election, there will be growth in the American population. Rick Perry knows this. Texas is one of the quickest growing states in the union. And what does he think the money supply is supposed to do? Sit there? It doesn't grow? We're just going to have less money as we have more people? That is a really quite bad idea.
Does this come from the idea that if you just talk generally about money and generally about spending and generally about debt without actually getting into the specifics of what it is that you're criticizing, just the mention of those things sounds bad to people and makes you sound like a fiscal conservative?
Yes, and then there's the other side. I call these meta solutions, right? They sound like solutions. They sort of even look like them if you don't look too closely, but they're not. We'll just pass it off to someone else, right? Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, they're unconstitutional, but we're not going to get rid of them. We're going to give them to states. It will be somebody else's problem. Monetary policy, we're not going to make decisions about it. We're just going to say we don't like it. The money supply just won't move. TARP, we're not going to say we would have done instead of it. We just wouldn't have had TARP. We wouldn't have had a stimulus, even though Rick Perry took billions of stimulus dollars and it kept him from going into a deficit in Texas. And so you have this sort of governing theory of just not really saying what you would be doing, but saying something, but nevertheless taking a position, right? And your position is no position. Your position is you don't like it, and we shouldn't have done it. And that is sort of enough, because who's going to ask the follow-up question?
Well, the follow-up question to me is, what's your big idea, bucko? Try to sound tough, to go mano a mano with the man who wants to be seen as a tough guy in this situation. At the same time, though, when you've got this many candidates running for the nomination, when you've got them all just saying no and them all just saying, I hate it all, are you actually elevating any of them to ask them to say what their federal policy would be. I mean, even when Mitt Romney has done that, as a guy who's been trying to take it seriously as a frontrunner here, and somebody who's tried to engage only the president and not the other candidates on the campaign trail, it seems like they're pretty confident they're not going to be pressed on those things because they just don't need to politically at this point.
And they're right. I mean, when I was watching the Fox News debate, and to which I thought the Fox News folks did a pretty good job, when I'd hear that doorbell go off after a minute of explaining what they would do about the hardest problems facing the country, it just made me sick to my stomach. Give them 5, give them 2, give them 3. I'm sorry if put the puppy on, but we might need to hear it. I mean, what's amazing about what Perry is doing is that the GOP used to have a big idea. It was called the Federal Reserve. Milton Friedman, he's a conservative icon. He was Reagan's economic advisor. He won a Nobel Prize as an economist. And he said the Great Depression, it was all monetary. It was a monetary failure. And Republicans like this. And by the way, he was right, but they liked it because that meant it wasn't private business's fault. And the only answer we have to recessions is in Congress spending a bunch of money. You can act through the Federal Reserve in a more disinterested way outside of the political process and get in the way of it. Perry is throwing all of that out, and he doesn't have a new framework to support what we should do. He just has nothing. But to actually get at that, you need to have a long conversation. You need to talk about Milton Friedman and monetary policy and money bases, and nobody likes that. But if we had basically the nothing policy that he's talking about, we would have had a Great Depression.
Well, when you look, though, at the spectrum of Republican idea that is being represented by the presidential candidates, whether or not that doorbell is going off at the debate, do you feel like there is an articulated conservative economic policy that is a legitimate alternative to what the Democrats are proposing, or is it all just no, no, no?
Well, there's Mitt Romney, who is sort of implying that maybe he'd do something similar to what the Democrats did, but not quite. I mean, a lot of what the Democrats did was basically stolen from George W. Bush or Mitt Romney. TARP and the auto bailout began with Bush. The individual mandate began with Mitt Romney. Stimulus is not a particularly conservative or liberal policy. Obviously, Bush had his own stimulus before Obama came in, and in the early aughts, Paul Ryan and others were saying we needed a big tax cut stimulus for that recession. So one of the problems the Republicans have, not so much Romney because he's pretty good at sort of fuzzing this stuff around, but the rest of them is that they have opposed everything the Obama administration did. But the Obama administration, in trying most everything, has taken off the table a lot of what the Republican Party wanted to do. So they are not left with very many solutions. Right. I mean, right now they're opposing a payroll tax cut, an extension of the payroll tax cut. Since when do Republicans oppose payroll tax cuts?
Right. And Newt Gingrich is the only one that is dissenting on that, which is fascinating. I cannot wait to see how that plays out. Ezra Klein, columnist for the Washington Post and Bloomberg, MSNBC policy analyst. Ezra has been guest hosting on the Martin Bashir Show here on MSNBC at 3 p.m. Eastern and doing a really